we've got a timer in here, right? A timekeeper?
I can keep it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, wait. There she is.
So, hang on one second. Are you guys all good with the tech?
So, everything good with the camera?
Yeah, it appears so.
Okay.
Okay, great, and we have a timer?
Yes, I'm your
Good
timer.
stuff. Okay, thank you very much. All right, when you're ready.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, panel. The criminal justice system is a messy and imprecise tool which significantly hampers the liberties of individuals and applies social censure, we think often in an unjust way. On opening government, Chin and I believe that the criminal justice system should sentence not based on our visceral gut reactions as to how horrible a crime is, but rather the actual proof in terms of what would lead to better outcomes for society, ensuring that we get less future victims and a more just society on aggregate. As such, we're remarkably proud to propose. I'm going to do two different things for you. First, I'm going to briefly outline what this debate is about. Second of all, I'm going to move into three constructive arguments. First, I'm going to explain why we have an obligation to future victims that is violated through using retribution as a means of sentencing. Second of all, I want to talk about moral luck and why these individuals who have committed these crimes aren't culpable for the degree of harm. And third of all, I want to talk about the disproportionate nature of the justice system and why this introduces more racial bias into sentencing and other problems. To begin with, the model. So I think that the model is fairly simple. This is a model that applies all throughout the world. In terms of what it actually looks like, this means that you're going to get less upgrades from things like a non-custodial sentence towards a jail sentence because of things like the fact that the crime was horrific. Instead, you'll consider things like whether or not it's best for rehabilitation. It also means that you would lengthen jail sentences on that basis. But it also means that the treatment of prisoners is oftentimes going to change as well. So in countries where things like corporal punishment and the death penalty apply, we support them in removing that because that's a gratuitous punishment that doesn't actually serve the purposes of the criminal justice system and doesn't serve to actually rehabilitate them, but is merely vindictive. So all those additional things like solitary confinement when it's not used for safety of other prisoners, etc., would be prohibited. Only when it's actually for a proper, legitimate purpose of the justice system, that is apart from retribution, would we allow those extra tools to be used. To begin with, I'm going to start off by talking about why we have an obligation to future victims and why we best succeed on that principle. So, I think that the purpose of the criminal law is significantly different from that of civil law, and that's for two significant reasons. The first reason is that you already have the civil law to get compensation for victims in many circumstances. So for instance, the crime of assault by actual bodily harm in the United Kingdom, for instance, oftentimes can also have a tort within civil cases in order to get compensation on a financial level. If you have significant injury done that you can't work anymore, you can get compensation within civil courts as well. That means that they serve two different functions. And the reason why we classify certain things as criminal matters is because they have an effect on the public writ large. So things like murder don't just affect this individual who is harmed, but also affects our ability to feel safe within society. So these are reasons why the criminal justice system serves a different function. As such, there should be less of a focus on the individual because they're compensated in other ways because the criminal justice system is not designed in that way, and more focused onto the future victims and societal goals. But the second thing to consider when we talk about weighing these interests is that we can't change the past. We can't change the psychological trauma that has occurred or the immense harm that's done. But what we can change is the fact that future victims may be harmed by poor rehabilitation and the fact that we might lead to more crime happening in the future. Therefore, we should care about those victims. So, why is it, no thank you, that this is a specific means in which we can stop poor sentencing that oftentimes causes worse outcomes? Because retribution oftentimes precludes the ability for people to actually rehabilitate. It means that you oftentimes get things like resentment towards the state for gratuitous punishment or punishment that seem unjust to the individual. And that means that they're more likely to join things like gangs to find a community within prisons and go out into the world with those gang connections because they feel isolated within that prison, even if they were never in a gang to begin with. It means that you're also going to get isolation where they have a loss of skills, a significant opportunity cost in terms of learning, and you have worse families who are probably more in poverty if the significant breadwinner was taken away. Finally, you have significant effects on employment and perceptions where people no longer want to employ these people or treat them well. Now, I understand this has to be weighed against the closure of present victims, But what we want to consider is that this is oftentimes contingent on those present victims having family and friends, and doesn't take into account the closure that is necessary for the family and friends of the person who has committed the crime. Those family and friends are also equally innocent, and you're punishing them by punishing this individual. Furthermore, we're going to suggest to you that oftentimes you want closure to alleviate the psychological harm that has been created. But insofar as we can protect future victims from that psychological harm, we win on that issue. So on aggregate, future victims are more important. Second of all, let's talk about moral luck and why the individual isn't culpable. Sure,
Why
closing.
can't you still have some rehabilitation without having to completely exclude retribution?
Because retribution by nature necessarily reduces the effectiveness of rehabilitation. That when you have retributive mechanisms, that means that you have to necessarily impose harsher punishments and harsher conditions which will make these people resent the state, which oftentimes puts them in jail when they wouldn't have been in jail otherwise, reducing their ability to live fruitful lives. So in terms of moral luck, first of all, I think the vast majority of individuals generally aren't culpable. This is a bit of a deterministic argument, but people are oftentimes dictated by the backgrounds that they have and about the genetics that they possess. That means that it's morally arbitrary whether or not we punish these people for those crimes because they oftentimes don't have control of those circumstances. As such, it's unfair to put on labels of blameworthiness when they have no control over these factors in the very first place. Opening.
Okay, how do you think this would impact the weightiness put on victim impact statements on your side of the house?
I think it would probably reduce the weighting on victim impact statements. I think that's fine. So, in terms of a second layer as to why these individuals aren't culpable, it's also important to note that there's a degree of moral luck in terms of the victim. So for instance, this means that someone who has attempted to kill someone versus someone who has killed someone are significantly treated differently even though morally they have taken the same action. Just because they're bad at shooting a gun doesn't mean that they should have different moral standards placed upon them. It also means that victims who are particularly different also are treated specially. So in the case in the UK, in R versus Deer, there's a situation in which a person reopened their stitch wounds after they had gotten medical treatment, and the original person who shot them was convicted of murder. Oftentimes you have to take the victim as they come, and that means that you have a circumstance in which, even if they're particularly frail and most people won't be harmed by that action, they are going to be murdered, and that is put onto you even if you couldn't foresee it, and even if it wasn't something that was likely as a consequence of your actions. Finally, why is this a disproportionate way of sentencing? I think that this is oftentimes a way in which you invite racial bias into the process. Because more than anything, retribution is based on the gut reaction of how horrible something is. So people naturally perceive a crime committed by a white man against a black woman or a black man as significantly less grievous than a black man attacking a white woman. And that is based on a subjective, inherent gut reaction. Now, I acknowledge that there's going to be racial bias in other areas of the justice system, but I think this is uniquely the case because it can't be researched or quantified, like looking at how sentencing affects rehabilitation. It is something that's inherently unquantifiable, and it's oftentimes subtle and indirect, so you can't directly measure it within a judge. That means that you can't hold them accountable and take them off of important cases or racialized cases when they have these subjective, inherent decisions which aren't based on research or not based on unquantifiable things. As such, I think that retribution is a tool in which justices and juries are able to use the justice system to unfairly attack individuals who aren't really guilty and hurt future victims. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
Can I just ask as well, I have no problem with you guys speaking to your partners, but try to keep it down a little bit. The judges are quite close to you. I think the speaker very much for his remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to deliver his statement.
If you remove retribution from sentencing, you may be removing it from sentencing, but you're not removing it from public thought. You're not removing it from what individuals actually want. We stand purely on the side that we need to actually have trust in the system, and that sentencing without retribution is inherently harmful and inherently biased, especially against those racialized minorities that the speaker just talks about. First, I'm going to get into some refutation, and then I'll get into my two constructive points. So first off, on their model, they basically model this as the world, and they're just like, yeah, basically this means you're not going to see corporal punishment, you're not going to see the death penalty, you're not going to see solitary confinement. That's great, you know? So like in the official justice system, you won't see these things. The reason why you see things like corporal punishment in official justice systems around the world is because culturally they believe that corporal punishment is a just thing to do as an act of retribution. While the criminal justice system will say, oh, well, we're not doing retribution, that doesn't mean the public doesn't. Insofar as this has been modeled as a world debate, I think that there are many governments that don't actually have a strong enough force to be able to contain these kinds of acts of retribution. Recognize that these were happening in the 1960s and 70s in the United States of America. So recognize that this will probably happen just as much, and probably more on their side of the house. Remember that when you don't actually impose the first system of punishment, when you aren't doing this, people go extra, people actually lynch you. That is what actually happens. Secondly, they talk about this obligation that exists and how basically you have civil court for financial services. That's great if you can afford a lawyer, but most people can't afford a lawyer to go after the person that hit them. Maybe the person that hit them is really rich and they'll lawyer up and beat them. I think it's a lot more of an equalizer when you have the criminal justice system looking at retribution and being able to dole out fines and being able to do things like that. I think that is much better. They then talk about how future victims might be hurt. The way that they say this happens is because you will have increased jail time, you will be more likely to join a gang, you'll be less likely to be employed, etc., etc. They basically, and so they say that this is how future victims might be hurt. Recognize two things. We care about current victims and how they feel and what retributive measures them and their families and their communities may take against the criminal. But two, we also believe that it's not that their motion is what actually puts more people in jail for a longer amount of time. How does it do that? When they basically talk about how attempted murder and murder are treated differently. This means that underneath their underneath their model, they would want to treat attempted murder and murder as the same thing. So if I'm trying to kill somebody but I don't kill them, I would still be sentenced with murder or something like that because we're not talking about retribution here. We're just talking about your actual action. Using that logic, you could say that all drunk drivers should be charged with actually being drunk driving and killing somebody and sending them, and I'll take you in a minute, and sending them to an early grave. I think that this just locks up tons more people than their side. I already said I'd take closing.
Right. So at the point at which it is true that in every instance of drunk driving, there's a possibility someone might be murdered as a result of your actions. Why is it a bad thing that individuals or perpetrators think about that at the point at which they decide to do the action?
Well, A, I don't think a lot of people actually immediately decide to do that action. I think that a lot of times it just happens. But B, I think that what you need to look at is the fact that if your actual model is to just lock up everybody who does something that could have gone worse, I think that is far more people in the criminal justice and far more people in jail. You're harming far more people on that side. First, on trust in the system. So recognize that we need to actually explain the principles of justice and where retribution fits into that. I don't think that was really done on OG. So first off, we have restitution, rehabilitation, and then finally retribution. So they already tackle restitution when they basically say oh, you have civil court, I've already refuted that. But secondly, on rehabilitation, we think that the weighing of rehabilitation in an equal term of restitution and retribution allows it so that rehabilitation is not the only thing we are thinking about, and not the only, because quite frankly, it is not the thing that matters the most in these cases in making sure that A, the criminal themselves doesn't get violently offended upon, but B, that society itself can actually improve. So basically, what's the point of the criminal justice system, right? Because in absence of retribution, you basically take away the illusion of a social contract that individuals have, right? This illusion that basically, you have the government to protect you, you can walk safely on the streets. What does this mean? This means rich individuals hiring private bodyguards because they don't know if the police are actually going to be doing things because of how retribution works out, because people aren't actually being put in jail, right? I think that this means that people move to richer areas and have white flight on a larger scale when they can't trust the criminal justice system to actually dole out proper retribution, and they don't think that they will be protected in these areas. I think that the impact on this, right? Let's look at an actual crime other than just murder that they talk about, right? Let's look at white collar crime, for example. Bernie Madoff, once he has been caught, has a 0% chance of reoffending. Why? Because nobody's going to do business with Bernie Madoff anymore, right? So if he has a 0% chance of reoffending, and they have civil so that he can just give out the money back, why does this person still deserve to be in jail? I believe that this person deserves to be in jail so that A, the individuals that actually were hurt directly by Bernie Madoff actually feel something coming from their criminal justice system, so that they are not isolated from it, so that they don't feel dissuaded. They actually trust the system. But secondly, we want to deter, right? Like if every white-collar criminal knows that all they have to do once they get caught is just give back the spoils of their crime, then there's going to be a lot more white-collar crime. I think this goes for a lot more crimes. Yeah.
Okay, then you have a heightened sentence because you want deterrence, not retribution. You can take into account deterrence and rehabilitation. That's where your model fails. You assume that we stop caring about those things too.
Okay, so if you only care about deterrence and rehabilitation, this sounds like a weird mix of like, oh, we don't want to lock people up at all, but we do really care about deterrence, so we're going to lock people up more. Like, you need to take an actual stance on that. Secondly, on sentencing without retribution, they talk about how victim impact statements, basically their power would go down a lot. We think that's bad. Why do we think about that? I think it's very important in a case where like the US Olympic gymnast coach is actually on trial and getting these victim impact statements going through. Having them legitimized by the criminal justice system makes these survivors actually be heard, right? It actually allows people throughout the community away from the trial also know that they will be heard, that the criminal justice system recognizes what they have gone through. And this leads to a harsher sentence, which makes people actually feel good about this, right? But on second hand, what about a criminal who comes from an underprivileged background, right? Where the victim actually understands the plight of this. I think the victim impact statement that says, hey, we should be punishing this person hugely, we should actually lay off, we should actually do these kinds of things. I think that's actually how you get like more on that, right? Ken's going to talk to you about demands for reform as well, but I basically think that you are able to question the justice system a lot better when you expect retribution from it and do not become complacent in that. Thank you very much for those.
I'm going to give his remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver his response here.
Everyone good? To quote Shakespeare, the quality of mercy is not strained. It falls gently, like rain. And I think this sums up our position on retribution. That murderers and rapists don't deserve mercy, but it's incumbent upon us, as members of a civilized society, to strive towards a kinder and gentler sort of criminal justice system. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things rebuttal all integrated. 1, on prospective justice, preventing crime. 2, on moral luck and the inherent unfairness of retributive sentencing. And 3rd of all, on racial prejudice and how this manifests uniquely in retribution. So, let's get cracking. First, on prospective justice. The premise of our case is that future victims matter the most in this debate because we can change the circumstances of the future, but we can't reach out through time and change the past. All's argument of victim impact statements and closure, and this is important, their argument concedes that the psychological harm suffered by victims in the aftermath of crime is morally significant. Therefore, if we can prove that we reduce crime in the future as a consequence of our policy, we also reduce the need for closure in the long run. Therefore, by their own metric, we win. So, in order to win this debate, we just need to prove that we prevent crime. And there are 3 mechanisms that Jason gave you that were not responded by opening opposition. Number 1, when you focus on retribution, you create a sense of learned helplessness. Prisoners start believing that they have no agency when they are idols upon whom the state can inflict violence upon. They are less receptive to rehabilitation at the point at which you are trained to give up agency by being locked up, having a routine control for you, by having, being chucked in solitary confinement. The second mechanism that Jason gave you is that you create or engender resentment towards the state. Prisons are now actively seen as the very organs of state that are being used to oppress and punish you, creating a cognitive dissonance when these same structures are also meant to help you get a better life. The third mechanism that Jason gave you is that it creates incentives to find alternative support structures within prison. Retribution, by necessity later, creates an environment of isolation. For example, you can't see family members, or you might get thrown into solitary confinement for a minor infraction. Sans support structures, you then turn to support structures that are available in prison. For example, prison gangs. Now we admit on our side there will still be some prison gangs because gangs are just a thing on both sides. But on your side you have more of them. You create more chances for recidivism and mingling with individuals who might lead you to commit more crime in the future. These 3 mechanisms alone win us the debate by opening opposition's metric. What did they tell us? First of all, vigilante justice. 4 responses. 1, people tend not to want to get a criminal record. If, I lynch people on the streets, I'm still going to be unable to find a job in the future. And in areas of low crime, this is my second response, where there is no trust in the state, there is no comparative harm. See areas like Nogales in Mexico, where, vigilante justice and rates of recidivism are already really high. Third response, it is unclear that loss of public faith in the criminal justice system is a unique harm in opening opposition, because there is an equal and opposite harm when minorities see the state as a violent oppressor when it focuses upon retribution. In fact, we think this harm is more important, because at the point at which entire minorities whom the state has already wronged in the past do not trust your criminal justice system, you are less likely to do things like call police when you see things are going wrong. This increases crime rate, increases harm. But before I go on, yes?
Your partner talked a lot about how there's punishments inside of jail, like you could be locked in solitary or not given access to your family. Those are all post-sentencing. Those are all delivered by the warden as punishments.
Yeah.
That doesn't have anything to do with criminal sentencing and retribution.
Yeah, but it's also part of our model. We also want this out of the debate. That's why we are explaining this in the first place, right? Also, as part of sentencing, a judge can also say you have a much shorter prison sentence, and as a consequence, the chance of you being mistreated in jail is diminished. So, or for example, the chance of you getting parole is a lot higher. So I'm not sure why you want to focus on this technicality. I'm just very confused. Fourth response to vigilante justice. This presents a very misanthropic perception of society. We argue that governments affect public perception in very much the same way that the public affects governmental behavior. For example, support for the death penalty in the UK. Before the government decided to abolish the death penalty, support for the death penalty was 70%. After the government established, a banning of the death penalty, this has fallen to about 25% right now. We argue that the government is often a vanguard for changing social perception because it changes the norm for how we see society. Then we heard from opening opposition some social contractarian analysis, i.e. Bernie Madoff. 2 responses. 1, we argue that Bernie Madoff still feels something. For example, he has to pay the money back to victims. For example, he can never return to securities trading because no one's going to trust Madoff securities. But my second response is that, look, it is not clear that deterrence is a prima facie most important part of criminal justice. If not, we would hang white-collar criminals in front of Wall Street. And the reason why we need to strike a balance is because we need to ask ourselves, what is the marginal increase of deterrence at the point at which we focus on retribution? And we argue low. Do you know why it's low? Because white-collar criminals don't just think, oh, it would really suck to get thrown in jail. They also think, it would really suck if I lost my reputation on Wall Street and I can't go back to the lifestyle I once led. So obviously, maybe on your side, you end up with a small number fewer white-collar criminals. But we argue that a vast majority of white-collar criminals are not just deterred as a consequence of punishment, they are deterred as a consequence of being caught and not being able to return to their original lives. But before I go on, go!
Fine, you strike a balance, so do we. If it turns out everyone is joining gangs because they're pissed at the state, we'll just reduce sentences. Happy to do that.
No, I mean, you could do that, but what I'm arguing is that still doesn't deal with the individual problems when it comes to how individuals interact with the prison system. I think these are still inherent to retribution that you haven't dealt with in our case. Next 2 things. First, on moral luck. Jason told you the premise that moral luck cuts both ways. First, it heavily circumscribes autonomy. Second, it affects the consequences of a crime, not really dealt with on OO. Instead, what they told us is that this treats everyone equally, leading to overcrowded prisons. But I'm not sure why that's the case, because we aren't punishing you for your crime. We are only locking you up insofar as we think that that's the best way to rehabilitate you. So for example, if you were caught for drink driving, if we think that you going to Alcoholics Anonymous and pledging not to drink again is effective rehabilitation and you show that you continually go back, we won't lock you up at all. But if you don't turn up at Alcoholics Anonymous, then we might have to lock you up to ensure that you get the appropriate rehabilitation. So we will only punish you insofar as it facilitates rehabilitation. In fact, it is your side that has egregiously long prison sentences when society wants people to be locked up for a really, really long time. CF Mexico, CF Brazil. Okay, last area on racial prejudice and how this manifests uniquely in retribution. Jason told you that our society's very activistic desire for retribution stems from a gut primal response in wanting to put something right when we see the harm has been committed. Unfortunately, this same gut primal response is also affected by things like how we see racial dynamics, how we perceive of the oppressor and how we perceive of the victim. And very often, statistics indicate to us that individuals of racial disprivilege, for example, Malay people back home from where I come from in Singapore, or African Americans in the US, have disproportionately long sentences as a very result of this primal instinct. For all these reasons, I'm so incredibly proud to propose.
I thank Stevie very much for his remarks and call upon the deputy leader to conclude before I have to start here.
alongside government is, although they say that they acknowledge the justice system will be biased with or without retribution being included, they fail to recognize the ways that those would be more pernicious and harder to deal with. That's the case that Alex clearly gives to you on our side. So first, I kind of want to just set up the kind of three tenets and why I think in absence of retribution, you get less ability to change the biases that happen in the justice system, really making clear what our stance are and what I think the important clash is, which implicitly deals with the future victim argument that we get from them. So on rehabilitation, recognize that the ways in which we think people can be rehabilitated are largely based on bias, right? You think that somebody with a previous criminal background is less likely to be rehabilitated for a good reason. But if you think black people are more likely to be criminal or have tendencies for criminality, then you think that person is going to need a longer sentence for their rehabilitation. Similarly for retribution, if you think that a white woman's body is worth more than a black woman's body, then you think that them being harmed means that that person has to go to have more jail time for retribution. The problem with that then is you still have the biased sentencing that they argue only happens on our side. I'm going to explain to you why. When you include retribution in the way that you consider the justice system, you actually get better ability to shift the ways in which we sentence in the first place to things that end up being better overall. First, I'm going to do rebuilding of my partner's points, although a lot of the aspects weren't really addressed. Then I'm going to do reputation. On the principles of justice. So Alexander tells you about how it's really important that not only that we uphold principles of justice as stated, but that people feel like those are being upheld. This is when he talks to you about the illusion of a social contract. It doesn't matter if the social contract is real, right? It just matters that individuals feel safe in the society that they live in and feel like they can go about their daily lives without fear of criminality at every turn. Why is this important? Because it does mean that people are likely to go to other means to protect themselves. They respond, people don't want to be vigilantes because they don't want to go to jail. This really much depends on the country you live in, right? Recognize in India, when women were being raped and they felt like men were being properly punished, they took it upon themselves to punish those men themselves, and they realized it was very unlikely they were going to get caught for those things, right? But also recognize it can be done without doing anything criminal. If you are a rich person in the United States and you hire private bodyguards and private security who are more likely to beat up someone who steals from your store, I would tell you that also punishes those people in unfair ways. I also think you're more likely to influence the justice system in ways that are actually biased towards other people, such as pushing for your politician friends to implement laws that make it harder for African Americans to vote in the United States and actually push for vote for judges who would be more fair. You have a POI?
Yeah, even if racial prejudices exist on both sides, at least minorities on our side aren't unduly subjected to retributive punishment.
But the problem is, if they're subjected to punishment that is harder to regulate within the justice system, that ends up being worse, right? So if they get beaten up by your private security, or if you completely disenfranchise them because you feel like you as an upper middle class white person aren't getting the justice that you deserve. Okay, so you feel like not enough will be done to punish them, so you punish them in other ways, basically. On white-collar crime specifically, so the response to our white-collar crime argument is there are other deterrents, which means that Bernie Madoff doesn't do what he does. I mean, he did what he did, right? But imagine he did that and then didn't get off at all. How much trust do you think people would have in the economic structure of the United States if they felt like a bunch of white-collar criminals were getting away with all of these things and they could be stealing their money right now? I think in a country in which that happens, you feel very uncomfortable in your economic situation. Corporations are likely to pull out of your country. I think this is terrible for the economic state of your country. Lastly, on demanding justice. Okay, I think this is a really clever point that I came up with in prep. So, recognize that victim impact statements work both ways, right? They admit to you, when I ask the POI, that victim impact statements will be less impactful in two ways. Recognize that when women, especially women, aren't heard, victim impact statements give them an ability to feel like they actually have an impact on the justice system. But this also means that people feel like they can demand more from the justice system, right? So in a world in which you think retribution is part of the justice system, you feel like you can say it was unfair, you didn't do enough to compensate for what happened. For example, when police officers are murdering unarmed black men in the street, people feel like they have a right to demand more retribution from the system. If retribution is a part of the system, they have nothing to demand. Furthermore, the government is less likely to give in to this because they feel like it's not something that they ought to demand. They feel like it's not part of the system that they're giving us back.
So would you argue for a lighter sentence for people engaging in sexual grooming with minors as opposed to them actually committing statutory rape with that minor?
So, I mean, if it's principally consistent with my case, sure. Okay, the point being though, it's really about the person feeling like they're actually able to express themselves and demand things from the justice system. When you purely have it on rehabilitation, restitution, then individuals feel like they're not supposed to be involved in the justice system, so they can't demand the reforms that are necessary to counteract the bias that OG talks to you about. We get rid of all sorts of bias on our house that are including retribution and aren't including retribution because you're able to demand this. For example, in the United States, when you elect judges, for example, when you elect politicians who can reform laws, so for example, in the Colton Boushie case in Canada, asking that juries no longer be able to just be selected, like you remove Indigenous people without any justification, for example, is a really good example. Okay, refutation. So, they give you this argument about obligation. They tell us in the second speech that they fiated in that we've gotten rid of solitary confinement and death penalty, then we'll fiat it on our side. They had to prove to us why it would actually be diminished on their side based on the resolution. But why won't it? I tell you, because things like solitary confinement have very little to do with retribution and have a lot to do with shitty racist guards, and that doesn't change on their side. And on the idea of moral luck. So they tell you that different people have different kind of situations, and if they feel resentment or helplessness, they're more likely to resort to gangs and basically commit again. The problem is that you still have terrible systems on your side, you just have no mechanism to ever get reform. On our side, people who feel like they can actually demand something from the justice system because the justice system has a principle of retribution that can work both in the ways of demanding more punishment but also demanding less punishment. You can advocate for things like better prisons, you can advocate for things like eliminating solitary confinements, which is happening right now in a lot of Canadian politics, for example, but you can only do that when it's viewed as part of the system, so you don't get any of the reforms on their side. I also think this refutes the thing about future victims. Recognize that victims feel they can't come forward because they feel that the justice system isn't there for them, it's just there for the criminal and their rehabilitation. They're less likely to come forward with, for example, accusations of sexual assault or to demand actual change. On balance, we think that you just get more long-term elimination of bias, whereas they just eliminate this short bias.
I think the speakers very much remarks and call upon the member of government to extend the case for kind bench here.
Judging by the way the opening half has set up this debate, it appears to be about a trade-off between short-term retribution or deterrence versus long-term rehabilitation. Unfortunately, that seems to be a rather narrow interpretation of what debate could possibly be. Closing government is going to show you that we are the side to cover a wider spectrum of cases and to be able to simultaneously achieve the objectives of short-term deterrence and long-term rehabilitation at the same time. Two extensions as a result. The first of which is how exactly the side of the policy of the government team can be fitted towards achieving short-term deterrence in addition to long-term retribution, right? So I think the fundamental assumption that opening opposition makes is the idea that short-term deterrence, based on the necessity of protecting current victims, based on the potentiality for vigilante justice and all the other impacts that imply, necessarily assumes that deterrence runs counter towards the long-term rehabilitative model that OG talks about. That's not true. For instance, we think that, simply put, if you have a case of attempted murder versus actual murder, for example, there might be instances in which you might prefer to impose a heavy sentence on both people who attempted murder but were unsuccessful in doing so versus people who successfully committed murder. The same applies for people who sexually groom minors but who did not actually engage in sexual acts as a result and therefore were not convicted of statutory rape. But we should give them the same sentence as those who committed statutory rape. And the same applies as well for people who drive under the influence but did not knock anybody down, but we should give them the harsh sentence in some instances as people who actually knock people down as a result of driving under the influence. No thank you. And the reason why is simple, right? Because we need to acknowledge that there are a wide variety of circumstances and cases that the criminal justice system has to deal with. In many first world developed countries, for example, where rehabilitative systems are fairly well developed, then it might well be worthwhile to adopt the opening government's model where a rehabilitative model ought to be the first priority. And in situations whereby either A, the rehabilitative model in your particular country is not as well developed, and so it's not something that you can rely on to reduce crime like in the foreseeable future in your country, or in instances where rehabilitation is a lower priority, for example, when dealing with instances of organized crime, where there is a low probability of being able to rehabilitate people who were captured as gang members or who were part of the mafia or who owed fundamental allegiances not to the society at large but to their bosses even after release. That is when rehabilitation might need to take a backseat, but we can simultaneously achieve short-term deterrence as a result by amping up the punishments like indiscriminately as opposed to according to racial or subjective means versus reducing such punishments. That is why we think that ultimately deterrence is something that we can still achieve on our side. No, thank you. And here I would like to draw a distinction between deterrence and retribution, right? Because while they may seem similar, the reality is that in a deterrent system, we punish you based on the act that you committed, regardless of the outcome. Whereas for a retributive system, not only do you take into account the nature of the act that you committed, but also the moral arbitrariness of the outcome that actually results from it. And that is why we achieve the first fundamental aim of justice, which is deterrence in order to reduce crime and protect victims now and as well as in the future. Before I move on to my second extension, I'll take opening.
So the problem with your case is even the types of crimes that are committed vary based on race due to economic circumstances, right? So don't you think that just means that you're over-criminalizing gang members because you think they can't be rehabilitated without actually reforming things the way that we can if we include retribution?
Right, so I assume that there will be a certain degree of racial bias, as OG has already talked about, with regard to determining whether they're capable of rehabilitation or not. But you don't want to add a second layer of racial bias with regard to whether, when you examine the severity of the act, whether the act may have been, on a subjective level, less severe than what the courts originally intended. So we are removing one source of bias, we cannot remove the other source of bias, but we'll make do with it for now. Second major argument on our side. So I think opening government labors under the assumption that we have thoroughly determined that the crimes for which these people are convicted are wrong, and as a result, we need to impose rehabilitative measures. But I argue that there might be a certain class of crimes for which it is uncertain whether it is truly morally wrong or right. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't convict them of these crimes. I think a subjective judgment has to be made with regard to, let's say, consumption of drugs, for instance, and that is inevitable, right? But we don't want to add an additional burden on people who are convicted under these laws by increasing punishments based on retribution, as opposed to simply taking into account other factors like rehabilitation or deterrence. And so what I'm trying to say is that under this particular instance, while it is not entirely certain as to whether these particular classes of crimes are right or wrong, we don't want to commit I wouldn't call it double jeopardy, but we don't want to commit the additional sin of increasing their punishments once we've already convicted these individuals for crimes which arguably in society may or may not actually be morally wrong, but we don't want to compound their punishment as a result. So as a result of both of these major arguments on the side of the closing government, we've accounted for a far larger spectrum of circumstances, right? In which A, some countries rehabilitation is justified and can work out, and in some countries rehabilitation may not be a viable short-term solution or a solution in the foreseeable future. And another class of instances in which maybe we're not even sure whether these laws are the laws we ought to be able to prosecute or the laws we ought to be able to enforce as a result. But before I move on, I'll take a second view. Closing as one? Yeah.
So you, in the first argument, you just gave reasons why considering intent in punishment is important. Why is that necessarily true with retribution? Why can't we also consider intent and attempted murder as punishable?
I mean, we're considering intent on both sides, presumably. The question is whether under a system of retribution you care about the outcomes of the punishment as well. We argue that we should not. I think that's been the central contention of both government teams. Right. So now that we've outlined basically what the two key arguments of closing government are and how they're distinct as well as important in this particular debate, let's revisit some of the arguments that you talked about, right? The reason why we run this particular argument on deterrence is because we understand that, contrary to what opening opposition says, that we're going to result in an increase of vigilante justice because we don't punish people adequately for their crimes. That's not true. When governments can make the judgment call that in some instances the balance between deterrence and rehabilitation ought to swing towards deterrence for that particular class of crimes in that particular context, in which case you don't get the outcomes with regard to vigilante justice or breakdown of law that they assert will happen without much justification. And if you want to talk about instances in which deterrence is necessary, then we argue that we achieve it better on our side, right? We argue that sure, we don't need retribution in order to punish people like Bernie Madoff, because we recognize that the principle of general deterrence ensures that we impose harsh sentences on people like him, not because we want to rehabilitate him or because we want to impose retributive sentences on him, but because we care about deterring other people in society from committing the same crimes as he did. Right? And the same applies for drinking under the influence as well. Sure, like there is a good chance that you might not actually knock down someone on that particular night, but that shouldn't matter to the average person, right? Like at a point in time in which you drink and you drove to the bar, it is probably important that you need to make decisions with regard to the worst case scenario and all these outcomes. That's where you should vote.
I think the secret Bismarck's and call upon the member of opposition to extend the peace for on the bench here.
Panel, the problem with the debate so far is that it has lacked an accurate comparative between what a retributive system and what without retribution looks like. We're going to be the first team that actually gives you that. We're going to tell you that contrary to what CG tried to assert in that last speech, retribution underlies any system of deterrence, because without retribution you cannot begin to conceptualize, for instance, the fact that worse crimes deserve worse punishments, or things such as that. We're going to tell you that a system that doesn't include retribution necessarily involves subjectivity, which will actually be the first grounding for the claims that that OO gives you on racial biases. But more importantly, we're also going to tell you that public faith is eroded, not necessarily because it's like a social contract that you buy into, but more importantly, because you ascribe moral weight to your victimhood, and you want the state to care about you, and the fact that it doesn't take your victimhood into account leads to actual problems. We're going to consider all those things. So first, let's talk about what a system without retributive justice looks like. So we think it's necessarily based upon subjectivity. Why? Because essentially we think the fact that you're like so we think that if you look at retribution plus or rehabilitation plus deterrence, right, or like mitigating factors, these are all individual sorts of judgments that are made by judges within a courtroom that are sort of like, let me look at the background of this person, see what they're actually up to, see whether they can be rehabilitated or not. In the absence of any framework or law that tells you this is how much society thinks we should punish people, you're unable to come up with a truly objective metric for how much you should punish people. So look, for instance, at the fact that all the penal codes that the world uses right now were operated like many years ago at a time when we discovered this is how much we as society, this is the weight we should ascribe to a particular crime or to that. We could be wrong about the particular crimes and the particular weights that are assigned to them, and we can change those. But the point is, those are the only guiding factors that judges have when they ascribe sentences. So what happens in the absence of those sentences? I think in the absence of those sentences, when you face a criminal in front of you, you're more likely to make subjective descriptions about whether or not they deserve punishment. So that's the reason behind like the conclusion that O gives you, for instance, which is if I see a white boy who went to like a private school who has possesses coke, I'm likely to be like, oh, this is someone who's fallen off the path, they can get back easily, and I'm likely to give them a much lighter sentence. As opposed to when I see somebody from a majority black neighborhood, I think from the rehabilitation perspective too, they're far less likely to be able, I see them as far less likely to get rehabilitated in the first place. Note what a retributive system though means. A retributive system means we weigh how important a crime is in the wrong that is done to society. So for instance, if possessing like coke or possessing weed does no harm to society, we're happy to say that in a retributive system that would do less crime than something that would deserve a smaller punishment than something that actually does harm. In the absence of that, when you are looking at rehabilitation, we think you give juries and judges the power to determine moral character to the things that individuals do. That's where racial and all the other biases we're talking about actually kick in. I'll take opening.
So in order for all your victim-based arguments to work, you first need to prove that retribution and rehabilitation are complementary. If not, you create more victims in the future, so by your metrics, we win.
No, that's not entirely true, right? So note the stuff that we tell you, which is retribution is the basis of deterrence. But then also note the fact that we can weigh these different things against each other, right? So if in the individual circumstance, like rehabilitation has to do with individual criminals, right? So if rehabilitation can't work, we're happy to bite the bullet on that, say, fine, you're not going to get rehabilitated, that's okay. But in the long run, if this is actually creating more criminals, then we're happy to say we don't put you in solitary, all those things, we don't have to get married to that principle. But here's the second one extension we're going to bring you, and this is on public faith. We're going to tell you why individual victims care a lot. So firstly, on victim perception, we think victims go to the court even though they know that they can't be protected anymore, right? They know that the wrong that's happened to them cannot be reversed. We still want them to go to court, and the reason they go to court is because they have this belief that a person will be punished because the state will recognize them as a moral agent whose victimhood deserves to be recognized, right? We think the state fails in this circumstance when it fails to account for retribution. Why? Because firstly, we think sometimes just perpetrators get off really easily. So note, for instance, that retribution is necessarily tied to proportionality, like in relation to how bad the crime was. So if, for instance, I was beaten up really severely, but my perpetrator gets off because I think it's easy to rehabilitate them, they haven't committed any other crimes, I'm far more likely to be mad that somebody who committed a lasting damage to me that would remain with me through the rest of my life is going to be off. So note, firstly, this gives us a principled imperative to care about victims and the things that happen to them. That is, it is a matter of principle that we care about the proportionality of how bad a sentence is depending upon how bad a crime is. But also, secondly, consequentially, we think it's awful because the alternative for what victims do means that they don't trust judicial systems entirely. So, like, do you guys know the opening of The Godfather, right, where Bonacera's like, hey, you gotta kill this guy because the justice system didn't do that? Like, that shit happens. It happens in Mexico. It happens in India, where you have entirely alternative justice systems. So, for instance, you'll note that, like, in rural India, people often go to, like, village courts because courts don't give them the kind of justice that they want. These are worse. They don't ascribe to anything. The most important thing in developing countries right now is to get people to trust the law and to obey the law. They fail at that. I'll take closing.
So how is it any easier to standardize punishments based on retribution versus rehabilitation or deterrence when they both rely on case law as well as statute?
No, that's where like society just gets together and they say, hey, I think murder deserves 20 years, I think like possessing coke deserves 3 years. That's how it happens. Whereas on your side, you have to be like, oh, how much this person gets like depends upon, their a whole history of mitigating factors. We can take those into account, but the point is we need a like standard for determining like what we need to depart from in the first place. Now let's deal with like the stuff that OG brings you, right? So first they give you a bunch of stuff on like caring about future victims, etc. Yes, I buy that we care about future victims. We do too, which is why we don't want people to be breaking the laws and going into all of that. But also the more important thing is we're happy to take this into account too, right? Like if it becomes a question of like deterrence in the future, like if a bunch of people are joining gangs, we don't have to marry ourselves off to a world in which people are just getting punished like severely for no reason at all. We do care about that. We have to care about 3 things as opposed to the 2 things that you care about on your side. But the second thing is, yes, like prison sucks, which is why we want it to suck so people don't commit crimes, right? So you have to decide whether you want like the kinds of rehabilitation that you talk about in your second argument, which necessarily means that we only take moral luck into account, or the kinds of things that matter for deterrence, right? Because you have to admit that at certain points, like deterrence is a particularly important function of the judicial system. We tell you that only comes from retribution in the first place. In the absence of any any reference to retribution, you can't do that. So CG then their first point is like, oh, there's a wide variety of circumstances. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like that's our response to OG. But also then they say this depends upon country. We're happy to say like in many cases we're happy to stress on retributive justice. That's what has underlined justice systems so far, and we think that's what gives us faith in them. But also we think more importantly, in response to their second stuff, we think all of this is premised on the fact that retribution and deterrence are different things. We tell you that retribution underlies deterrence, so we're happy to be on off.
I thank the speaker very much for his remarks and call upon the government to please decide proposition today.
Panel, the criminal justice system is one that is inherently infinitely subjective in the way that opposition would like to argue to us, in the sense that everything that we decide to be right or wrong within the criminal justice system itself is a result of a bunch of arbitrary factors, oftentimes that we did not even consent to in the first place. So for instance, our representatives in government and the horse trading they do in parliament could somehow arbitrarily decide that possessing marijuana is enough to sentence you to death, for instance. I mean, that's not something that we're willing to stand by. The idea that we were trying to push forward in closing government was the idea that retribution is itself a very subjective idea, because it has to do with trying to attach exactly like what opposition says, moral weight to a particular action. And we don't think that the criminal justice system should ever have the right to do something like that. Rather, we think its only function is to ensure the continued functioning of society in a manner in which individuals are able to live their lives uninterrupted, rather than being able to make some sort of punitive judgment about what is correct or what is wrong based on the fact that oftentimes these are decided by people who are not us in the first place. That being said, the first thing I want to do in this particular case is to draw the distinction between deterrence and retribution, which I think it deals with a large bulk of the first half of closing opposition's argument. The other side argued that it's inherently subjective to be able to, for the criminal justice system to not have retribution, because this means that now you just randomly give, for example, the Stanford swimmer a much shorter sentence than someone that you think is much harder to rehabilitate. The first thing we need to do is to argue that deterrence and retribution are inherently different. So to the extent to which we think that rape or murder are much worse charges, we are happy to say that we'll have certain statutes, for example, that govern the fact that we want to have longer sentences for that, because arguably we think they require a longer deterrence. That's different from saying that we want to create a moral judgment on this particular act and randomly say that, for example, murder requires a longer prison sentence than that of, say, for example, drink driving. We would argue that there is still an ability to have some level of objectivity or some level of standardization on our side rather than theirs. No, thank you. But secondly, I would argue that this idea of subjectivity being infinite without retribution is a problem, because on their side, this idea of the fact that murder and etc. is something that's wrong and deserves a longer sentence, like they said themselves, are incredibly arbitrary. So in the past, for instance, we might have thought that murder required X amount of years to be sentenced, or that drug use required X amount of years to be sentenced. That changed over time. But the point of matter here is that these are often dictated by certain sectors of society and not representative or not necessarily the view of a large number of people. So where we come from, for example, drug use, for example, is still something that can be sentenced to death, and that is entirely a result of the idea of, no thank you, on a large part, retribution and the idea that you're creating some sort of you're doing some sort of moral wrong, rather than the idea that this is something that objectively helps society function as a whole. Yeah, I'll take a POI. Probably, yeah.
Okay, so the problem is, with rehabilitation, you say it'll take 10 years for this drug user to never possess drugs again. On our side, when retribution is an element of the criminal justice system, you ask how much retribution is warranted. When the answer is none, you push for decriminalization, and you can only do so because you consider retribution as an aspect that's necessary.
No, but that's an idealistic view of the problem, right? Because if you are saying that somehow people are able to come to the conclusion that retribution is not an aspect of drug use, then maybe there will be decriminalization. But the entire point of the idea of rehabilitation is that people believe that there is a problem with drug use in the first place. To the extent to which we still think that they deserve to be put behind bars for drug use, we don't think the outcome of decriminalization that you're talking about will even happen in the first place. Now, let's talk about the idea of deterrence and the first extension that Adil brought to you. We argued that outside was much better for deterrence because we made people acknowledge the end result of what they were doing rather than simply randomly sentencing them based on arbitrary circumstances they could not control. So the example of drink driving, for instance, the idea is that an individual who could accidentally have been drink driving one day and perhaps cause some sort of bodily harm to an individual is going to be punished a lot worse than an individual who repeatedly drink drives. No, thank you. But fortunately, due to certain circumstances, never actually committed any harm. We argue the second case is of an individual who requires that length of time in rehabilitation because they possess a much bigger threat to society, and that's what the criminal justice system ought to do. But on the outside of the house, that cannot happen, and the first person is arbitrarily punished, even though it's entirely likely they would never have done this particular act. Again, we argue the criminal justice system ought not make certain decisions based on what opening says, it's a certain gut or visceral reaction, which we think are subjective, in order to make those specific pronouncements on how long a person should be put behind bars. That's why we argue that deterrence was much better on our side, because we were at least better able to ensure that society functioned properly by making people acknowledge the worst possible result of what they did, but actually looking at the facts of the case and deciding how much of a threat they present to society, rather than how much wrong that they have done, which we think is something that we are making determinations of by ourselves rather than others. Yeah, closing.
Through retribution, society says these are acts that are antisocial and terrible. We want to punish you for them. In absence of reference to that kind of retribution, how do you set norms about what is socially acceptable and what is not socially acceptable?
No, but that was precisely what we were trying to say. We were trying not to do that. So for instance, if a person decided that being homosexual was something that's considered morally wrong, on your side, that would be something that they would give retributive punishments to as well. Whereas in a world, no thank you, in which you try to determine the amount of harm that could give to society, in the sense that you're trying to protect society and allow for the continued functioning of society, you would not otherwise put that person behind jail for an additional length of time based on this additional value or this additional component of retribution, rather than just perhaps rehabilitation and the like. So let's be clear. In this particular debate, we agree that a lot of the problems, because of the fact that retribution is difficult to distinguish from both deterrence and rehabilitation, might still exist on both sides. But the question is about the extent to which these problems exist. And with the additional value of retribution, we argued, was principally unjust in and of itself. We ought not have that as a consideration value because we thought that this particular value and the decisions made on an idea that's inherently subjective are not decisions that we want to have on top of the kind of crimes that were currently created right now. Let's continue on this particular idea. So the second thing that we wanted to talk about was this idea of victims and what opening opposition want to talk about when it comes to victims. So they argued that retribution introduces the idea of control to victims and prospective victims. There are a few reasons why this is wrong. Firstly, we think the criminal justice system ought not be handing the reins of justice to victims who are not in an emotional position to rationally decide what these outcomes are in the first place. That's why we think that the magnitude of victim impact statements on their side is massively overblown. The second thing that we told you was that it was problematic that the perceived harm to the victim was the way in which we were able to make these decisions. So the POI that Adele asked you, for example, about sexual grooming, at the point at which the victims, for example, were manipulated into believing that the harm that was caused to them was a lot less, their side would be happy to say that as a result of retribution, this means that the victim ought to be, like, I don't know, that the perpetrator ought to be, for example, rehabilitated less because of this value of retribution. It means that they are now sentenced less. We think that's problematic as well. But lastly, this idea of like alternative justice systems, let's just be very clear. In a world in which like there is problematic enforcement, it's not about the idea of retribution that results in alternative justice systems, but rather the idea that they are not going to be caught. So to the extent to which people still don't have trust in your police force and your ability to catch criminals, those alternative justice systems will still exist. That's not a part of this debate. I'm happy to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for the remarks and call upon the opposition whip to conclude this round of debate here.
Ultimately, in a round about criminal justice, the most important thing we have to consider is what happens to the people being convicted. We think all the problems that were given to you by OG and by CG about why society is in a place where a lot of times people who shouldn't be convicted are convicted in the wrong ways and given the wrong sentences are only furthered by this fundamental shift in legal structure that makes it much easier for biases to pervade the system and lead to tangibly worse outcomes for those we think should be protected the most. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk to you about the people who are going to be convicted and what actually happens to them and the most important impacts regarding that. Then I'll talk to you about overall crime in society and how we actually change societal structures. And finally, I'll talk about victims, specifically current victims, but also some stuff on future victims. So, first, why should we care the most about the people being convicted? A couple of reasons why we should care about them more than other actors in this round. Firstly, note that the impact of being convicted is really significant regardless of whether you have a rehabilitative or retributive outcome. That is, even if you're in a program for like treating alcoholism, you're there for a long period of time, all the stuff OG said was bad, like preventing your ability to get employment and stuff, still affects you a lot, which means the people that are harmed the most by a justice system, especially the minorities that people in this round care about a lot, are those that are being convicted. But also know that these are the ones that are most tangibly impacted by the system itself. That is, we control the mechanism by which their lives are changed. That is the stuff that Fed told you in his last speech about retribution, how retribution controls the internal link to this. So, why do we win? And note, this puts us above OO because all they say is like, oh, there's a chance for bias to occur, but what Fed gives you is the unique mechanism for why retribution means that you're going to have more objective outcomes. That's because rehabilitation is inherently individualistic, while retribution is always going to be act-based and therefore more objective. That is, if you have a retributive system where you say X act, like littering here leads to this outcome, that's fundamentally something you can do in an objective way, and something that people can, 1, hold the law accountable to if it's being biased, and 2, means that people are less likely to have to make subjective assessments about the individual. Compare this to a rehabilitative system where necessarily it's about what will happen to the individual. Like in a law, you can't be like, what will Jeremy do in this situation? What will Sally do? Like, you have to have an objective system that can't have those individuals when you're talking about these acts, which means if it's a rehabilitative system, you're always going to have individual biases pervade. Why is this super important? We think firstly it means that these people are much likelier to be worse off, i.e. the minorities that are already disproportionately affected by these systems are worse off, but also in areas in the developing world, which are like a majority of people anyway, especially in systems that are being formed. It means that these legal systems are not given the structure they need to actually be trustworthy and actually follow out the order of the law, because you need to have a consistent set of principles that matches the action, not something that's subjectively based on each individual person. But secondarily, we think it is what leads to minorities resenting the system and feeling a sense of helplessness when they feel like, look, it's much easier for a judge to make an arbitrary call about what I need and why I should be like in a system longer because I have so many problems, which we think is going to be the crime and stuff that OG talks about. Sure, I'll take
From PM, I say that you can have research and statistics on things like rehabilitation from certain punishments, whereas retribution is inherently the gut. That means you can hold judges accountable and replace them when they don't use those research and statistics. That doesn't doesn't engage with my very
But
first.
that's just factually untrue, right? Like there's always a lot of subjectivity about what will actually help a person in the future versus something that is set aside as a specific response to a specific action is always going to be more objective. That is also just empirically true, right? Like we have X responses to X crimes versus we can't, like you literally just can't be like, for this type of alcoholic from this background, this will happen. It has to be an individualistic subjective judgment. Like that is literally the principle by which rehabilitation is founded. The final thing with this is how we set norms. Like the way we set norms is if you know if this happens to me, this is what I'm going to have to face, which means that in terms of people not being treated unfairly by the system, they actually know what is going to happen to them when they commit a certain act, which means that you're always going to have more objectivity in the system. Finally, this idea that like you don't consent to the law and so like this stuff doesn't matter, note that firstly, we think that no one in this round is actually changing the underlying societal structures that lead to all of these biases happening, which means it's a question of who best works with these biases and makes the system better. But secondarily, note it's not like people don't know what the outcomes of these conflicts, the outcomes of these crimes are. Like by living in a society, you know what the laws are, you have consented to those legal systems. What they do is they fundamentally change the structure. So like a minority, like if I like do a certain crime, I wouldn't know what would actually happen to me if it's individualistic and based on rehabilitation, which is always comparatively better for those. Note that we provide a unique mechanism for why it's individualistic, not act-based, which means that puts us above our own. Now I'll talk about crime and deterrence and the stuff that everyone else wants to talk about. Okay, so the stuff that CG tells you is that like firstly there's going to be like less deterrence, but note that they just don't respond to the material Ben gave you about how retribution is necessarily linked to deterrence, because if you think you can have like a cushy, like more reach and rehabilitative experience when you're a criminal, there's literally no reason for you to not want to do a crime. Now they say, oh, people don't consider that when they're doing crimes, but like I don't know, I think about that sort of thing when I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want to litter, I should pick that up like because like someone's gonna see me, like this is gonna be considered bad by the law. Also know that the law also dictates what social norms are, like a lot of times those are things that are important. Also, if you want to change society, that gives you something tangibly and concrete for you to change that actually allows you to shift social norms to be something that is good. Now, OG tries to tell you like, oh, people are learning helplessness in the system, and that's going to lead them to crime, and that's why rehabilitation and retribution are fundamentally incompatible. Note that one, we think having a just proportion to crime is important for victims, which are also involved in this, which means you should weigh that above that. But secondarily, helplessness is also something that happens on their side of the house. Like you're being told like, oh, you have to learn this set of things, and you have to do like you have a problem with mental health, with that sort of thing, which means that you're actually more like you're still getting all the harms they talk about. They don't tell you why rehabilitation will tangibly work. Instead, that told you rehabilitation is actually more likely to decrease the effectiveness of the legal system. For example, if you're someone with a lot of money, you can be like, oh, like I know I did this crime, but like I had a mental problem, like I need rehabilitation. That is something that is proportional to your amount of influence in society and your ability to actually access the criminal justice system. Sure, I'll take this.
So presumably if everything you're saying is true and perhaps you recognize that certain individuals might require more rehabilitation than others, why is it a problem? Why can we not then give them longer sentences rather than standardizing it such that people who don't need those long sentences get it as well?
No, we're saying that the choice how sentences are determined in your system, like the system that does that, is something that's going to have biases that are the most tangible impacts in the realm. Like having that system is bad in and of itself. So we think that's problematic. So in terms of deterrence, we think having a scary option versus having a non-scary option is definitely more likely to deter people. And then on this idea of people committing more crimes, let's talk about victims and actually get this tangibly done. So first we think current victims are probably more important in terms of the way you do here because one, the degree of harm done to them is important, and secondarily, we just think there's a legal right to proportionate justice based on what you do, especially in systems where legal courts are not yet built, especially to make them avoid doing things like Ben said in The Godfather, for example. So that means that the current victims are people that should be considered, and insofar as rehabilitation doesn't consider that retributive aspect, you're fundamentally denying the victim's right to this, which is the more clear harm to them than future victims. But we also think you're saving future victims if you deter crimes in the first place, but moreover, there's no reason why, like, if a person has been tangibly harmed by someone else, the system owes more to them rather than the generic populace because they've already faced a harm based on the conditions society placed on them. How does this round break down? Firstly, know that the most tangible thing the criminal justice system can do is avoid being horrible in the way that it's like actually committing people to jails and systems. We think you're only going to make the system much worse in a very tangible way. Secondarily, you're going to encourage more crime to happen because of deterrence. And finally, you don't care about victims. So,
Thanks very much, everybody.